It's the Hero Show. Welcome to the Hero Show, everybody. Starring the irrepressible Andrew Bernstein and the resilient Robert Begley. I am Andrew Bernstein, and you are indubitably Robert Begley. How you doing today, Robert?
I am doing great today, Andy. Super excited to talk about a childhood hero of mine, somebody I literally went walking the streets of New York City looking for because he was a recluse, sadly, the last 25 years of his life. But we're going to talk about his heroic achievements today.
Right. And that is the extraordinary, versatile and brilliant Howard Hughes, one of the great
Yes.
aviation designers, in the world, a great record-setting test pilot, a great
Mhm.
filmmaker, a great entrepreneur who took on, the government's attempt to provide a monopoly of Pan Am, and something of a
Yes.
ladies' man, also we might say, and that is
Quite
the
a bit.
extraordinarily gifted, yeah, the extraordinarily gifted Howard Hughes. So we can start out his dates: 1905 to 1976. There he is,
Yeah.
good looking dude. And he was tall, wasn't he? Like 6'3" or 6'4" or
Six
something like that.
three, tall, thin, from a family that dated back to early America. His family came, I think, from Scotland to America, and his parents were in Texas, and is where he was born, Houston, Texas. Aline, I like that name, not spelled the same as your sister, was a name of his mom. And he had an interesting childhood because she was a super duper germaphobe, and that transitioned into him. And there were some mental health issues on her side of the family that I believe also went into his life. So from an early age, a part of his life was somewhat set where could things could have turned out differently, but incredibly independent, incredibly ambitious to do things, loved to tinker with toys, with radio, with bicycles, and and his father had this tool company, wanted to drill for oil in Texas. It was the Texas boom, and basically founded the Hughes Tool Company, which
Mhm.
was the entirety of Howard Hughes's life, was a major factor in his life.
Yeah, I mean, I guess a personal story here about that I
Hmm.
want to start with, and that is when I was a kid growing up, 1960s. Howard Hughes died what, 1976. He
Yeah.
was only 70 years old. It's amazing how much he packed it, how much achievement he was able to pack into 70 years. So I don't know if the guy ever slept, but but anyhow, uh, I didn't know anything about Howard Hughes's extraordinary achievements. He was just this eccentric billionaire who was holed up in his Las Vegas hotel suite.
Hmm.
I was
Hmm.
extraordinarily germophobic. He was extraordinarily afraid of germs. That's all that I ever heard about Howard Hughes when I was a kid, and so it was just well, that's kind of weird. But I didn't really think much about it. I really didn't know anything about Howard Hughes's extraordinary achievements until I saw Martin Scorsese's film The Aviator in
Wow. Wow.
2005.
Yeah.
And I was never a big DiCaprio fan before that, but I thought Leonardo DiCaprio was outstanding, in that
Me
role,
too.
and really admired him in some of the roles he's played since. And so after seeing The Aviator, it's a great movie, by the way. I strongly recommend it. And
Yes.
Scorsese's a great filmmaker. There's no doubt about it. He might be a little
Hmm.
mentally ill himself at times, I think, but
I think so.
but he's but he's a great filmmaker. And so I did a little research after that, and I thought, wow. I mean, Howard Hughes was a great filmmaker. He was a great designer, aeronautical designer. He was a great test pilot, and he was a great entrepreneur. He had like four careers all packed up into one, and that doesn't even
Hmm.
count the dozens of Hollywood actresses and beautiful, women and starlets that he dated and was romantically involved with. I don't know. Like I said, I don't know how the
Hmm.
guy had time to sleep, but you know, as a womanizer, that's that's we don't we could discuss some of that because it's part of his life. But his achievements in these four different fields are
Yes.
just it's just amazing, and it's just tragic. We have to discuss the mental illness that afflicted him, and
Yeah.
ended his life. But again, I want to say I thought
Hmm.
Scorsese did a very good job in the film The Aviator. He showed the mental illness. You can't do a biopic of Howard Hughes without it, but he focused on Howard Hughes' achievements, and I thought that was very well done. The way Scorsese balanced
Hmm.
it in the movie. But Howard Hughes, I mean, I think the title of the film, The Aviator, I think that's probably accurate in that. Correct me if I'm wrong, because I know you know more about Howard Hughes than I do, but
Hmm.
it looks like to me like in all these great achievements of his, aviation is his first love, right? And designing
Yes.
airplanes, designing and flying airplanes is his first love and his great passion. It seems to me.
You're
Is that
right.
accurate?
You're right, Andy. Yeah. So when he was 14 years old, he went on a plane ride with his dad. He totally idolized his father, and he went on a plane ride, and the father was a bit shaken, but Howard Hughes fell in love with the concept of being in the air, and he never let go of that. So if we go through his childhood, he was not brilliant. He was not certainly not stupid. He was always somewhat socially awkward. Developed a uh, hearing disorder at an early age. Was a bit sickly, so never really athletic. And a domineering mother who was a big, just a real big influence in his life. And his father has this tool company that is starting to expand, as I said, going along with what's happening in Houston and oil. His mother dies when he's like 16, 17 years old. And then his father calls him home because he was at like some kind of prep school far away, calls him home. And then the father dies, heart attack during a business meeting. And he's 18. And the legal age back then was 21, but Hughes went to court to basically take over the entire estate, the business, and he became the chairman of the board. We talked about Sinatra recently being the chairman of the board. So he's like in his teens, and he's the chairman of a board of an organization, Hughes Tool Corporation. And with that, he he has a relative who does some screenwriting in Hollywood, and he wants to run the business, but another dream of his was to go to Hollywood and make films, and so that was his first. Aviation would come very shortly afterwards, but the first era of his life where he started to gain some status was in the mid 1920s when they still had silent pictures, and he wanted to make bigger and better movies. He had this grand vision. At first, he was a novice, so he hired people to do the bulk of the film productivity. But the thing that put him on the map, which blended the two, Andy, was this film called
Yeah.
Hell's Angels, where
Right.
he wanted to show two British soldier brothers fighting over a girl during World War I. And aside from any other country, he amassed the highest, the most aircraft. He went all over Europe, or had his men go
Right.
over Europe to buy planes, 21 cameras, and then he gets in to do some of the stunts himself, and that's when he caught the bug, Andy. So he got a chance to blend the two, aviation and filmmaking, and completely set
Hell's
course.
Angels. Hell's Angels is very famous. It's a landmark film in Hollywood. I've never seen it,
Yes.
but you have, right?
Yeah.
What do you think of Hell's Angels as
Well,
a
it's,
movie?
off the thing about I think the thing about Howard Hughes is that when he had an idea of what he was never the plot guy. It was never the story. It was about what he can do with whatever his vision was. So this one was aviation, and he put you there. They capture it well in the film The Aviator, which I highly recommend. which is largely accurate. By the way, if I just say Scorsese took a 20-year period of Howard Hughes' life, and it was the 20 most productive years of his life, which we're totally grateful for, both Andy and I. And that's why we love the film so much. But
Mhm.
Hell's Angels, the plot is somewhat thin. Two brothers fighting over this girl, but it's the flight
So you
scenes
know,
and sadly two.
19,
I think there were three
right?
collisions that
Yeah,
led to
several
deaths.
pilots died. Several of his pilots died making that movie.
Yeah, he had a near miss. Hughes himself had a near miss, and one scene they capture in the movie, which is very accurate, is the filming. You couldn't see the perspective. You couldn't tell how big the planes were without something in the background, which were
Right,
clouds. And
right,
he's calling. He hires Ian Holm, who would later be Bilbo Baggins in the Lord of the Rings movies. He hires him to he's teaching at UCLA, and he's like, "Find me some clouds." And
right.
weeks later, while everything is on the set, nothing is happening. So they're losing thousands and thousands of dollars a day. There's clouds in Oakland. They all go up to Oakland. They film it. It's incredible.
Which is like
Then Andy,
400
then they
miles away from LA.
for
That's not
yes,
that's not like right
yes.
around the corner.
So he's already poured $2 million into this movie, and Al Jolson's The Jazz Singer comes out. He's ready to release it. The Jazz Singer comes out, which introduces the talkies. The silent movie era is over, and now Hughes has to redo it with sound. He has to make sound. And Andy, I told you before, there's so many Ayn Rand parallels in her novels, but this is like a Howard Rourke with the Sanborn House, where he's not satisfied and he's
Right.
going to pay money to do something right, and that's Hughes could not see the film as a silent. He needed to put in sound and dialogue, and they had a foreign actress who was the lead role, but her accent was too thick. So he got Jean Harlow, out of nowhere, and she put her on the map as
Yeah,
an
that made
actress.
Gene Harlow a star, right? That
Totally
the
did, yeah,
Hell's
yeah. And
Angels.
he did this over and over again. He made stars out of these actresses who were doing different things. But Hell's Angels was the first like grand achievement in
Yeah, it was an epic,
in
right?
Hollywood
And
history.
and
Yeah, it was an epic.
yeah, and it was like you were saying before. I mean, what stands out there is the special effects of the day. It was that was like 1930. It was released, something
Yeah,
like that.
that's right.
But but
Yeah,
it's the special effects. Like 40 odd years later, when George Lucas comes out with Star Wars, the special
right.
effects take a quantum leap forward. But that's what I
Yeah.
the only parts I've ever seen of Hell's Angels are these amazing aerial combat scenes. So I mean,
Hmm.
that must have
Hmm.
been the big
Yeah.
draw in the for the movie. But let me ask you this, because Oakland, did they go all the way up to the Bay Area, or was there in Oakland
Yeah,
in
they
Southern
did. Yeah,
California?
they
Because
went.
they
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 went
flew like
to that. Did the
350
act?
miles, to get clouds. I mean, they went 3 to 400 miles to get clouds. All right, well,
Yeah,
wow. That's being a perfection. That's being a perfectionist, isn't it? Now, the
that
one Howard Hughes,
totally is being a
yeah,
perfectionist.
yeah, the
And
one
then the
Howard
next.
Hughes
So then
movie.
the next thing.
But I saw Scarface. The Paul Muni film a
Okay,
long time ago.
go ahead.
I saw
Talk
that
about
movie.
Scarface, because that was his
Yeah,
next epic.
I just remember it being, a very violent gangster movie. And Paul Muni is a very, very good actor. I saw that like on the Late Show when I was a teenager. I didn't even realize at the time that was Howard Hughes, that was a
Yeah.
Howard Hughes movie, but it was. And when we were discussing this yesterday, you were saying that Howard Hughes deliberately wanted to take on the gangsters and show what brutal murderers these guys are,
Yeah,
making that movie. That's
he has a quote saying Scarface is an honest indictment of gang rule in America. Okay, so at first they thought it was like a pro violence. They just saw the violence, dropping the context of the scenario, and he's saying no, this is evil. And there was a Scarface at the time who was
yeah,
doing
yeah.
bad stuff, namely Al
Well, what?
Capone. And
Yeah,
Capone
that
did
was
not
just
like the
yeah,
movie and went to one of the, he had his henchmen try to strong arm some, not Hughes himself, but some of the other executives, I think. And it didn't, it still went on. He faced opposition, certainly from the censors, as far as, you can't have that much violence,
Right.
and people flocked to the movie. So it was another epic. It was another big financial success. And now we're into the 30s. So
Yeah.
if
Well,
we
yeah,
say
the what year
1930
that
with
movie that movie
32,
came out in 1932, was it? So you we're in the
yeah,
Depression,
we're in the
and of course,
depression. Yeah,
yeah, and Prohibition is still going on. So Al Capone, the real life
that's right.
Scarface, in Chicago, has an enormous amount of wealth and power.
Yeah,
And yeah, Howard Hughes showing some courage here, taking on these murderers, showing the American,
independence. Yeah,
public,
he
yeah,
was.
showing the American public what bad guys. Some of these movies glorify gangsters. And I don't remember
Yep.
the original Scarface. The Al Pacino remake, 50 years later, Scarface with Al Pacino,
Yes.
and that's a very young Michelle Pfeiffer in that film, right? Uh,
Hmm.
that was also very violent, but it might
Yeah,
have been more of a glorification of gangsters than
that
like
was.
like these
That
gangster
definitely was.
movies.
Brian De Palma
Yeah,
definitely was. Yeah.
yeah.
But
Brian De
by
Palma,
the
right?
time the Godfather movies came out, and that, I think that changed the genre, making them more somewhat sympathetic. But Howard Hughes was not doing that. And now that he's a big star in, producer with a lot of power in Hollywood, if we could just, go into
It's just
some
just
of
let
the
me say
women.
something. Let me say something else on
Yeah.
this, Robert, because the Al Pacino remake it was Brian De Palma, you said, right? Who directed that?
Yes. And
Yeah.
Oliver Stone
Uh,
wrote it, actually.
oh, is that right? Okay, yeah, and of
Yeah.
course the Mario Puzo uh, flicks, the Godfather flicks
Godfather.
in the 70s. This is 40 or 50 years after Prohibition, and gangsters didn't have the kind of power, the 1970s and 1980s that they had in major cities in the 1930s. And so, you see why Howard Hughes making a moral statement here about these bad guys, that they really are bad
Hmm.
guys, and courageous. These gangsters had a lot of money back then, and they had a lot of political clout. I mean, Al Capone controlled parts of the what was
Yeah,
it, Cicero, Illinois, outside of Chicago. He
that's
bought, he
right.
had the money.
Yep.
He's making millions, which is a lot of money back then. It's a lot of money today, but it was really
Hmm.
a lot of money in 1920s and early 1930s. He could buy judges and police chiefs and
Hmm.
police officers and everything. These guys had power, and they were evil, and they killed a lot of people. And so
Yeah,
I think Howard Hughes making a moral
it's
statement and doing it
courageous.
courageously. Yeah, yeah, it was courageous.
That's right. So if we go to the women in his life, he marries
Oh,
Ellen
this guy.
Rice, who was,
Right.
she's 21 and he's like 22, 23, from Texas, the Rice University that he actually went to. She
Oh,
was a
that's right. Yeah, that's
descendant
right. That's right.
of that family. But once he's in Hollywood, there are no morals, sadly. Hollywood is just not known for high moral standards. And he's with all these different women. Ida Lupino was one of the first ones, and she was a prolific female director, who he helped her. Ginger Rogers fell in love with. Katharine Hepburn fell in love with. Asked Proposed to both of them. I think Katharine Hepburn turned him down, and then 2 days later he proposed to Ginger Rogers, and she said, "Hold your horses." And so he definitely the eccentricities in his life.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
Betty Davis.
You
Mhm.
know,
Go ahead.
yeah, in the Aviator, Scorsese shows a good deal of the Howard Hughes Katharine Hepburn relationship, and Kate
Yeah,
Blanchett plays Katharine Hepburn in the sounds
perfectly.
like Katharine, yeah, sounds like Katharine Hepburn. If I close my eyes, I think I was hearing Katharine Hepburn, and
Hmm.
he shows, Scorsese shows the foibles of that relationship. Looks like they were in love with each other, at least the way Scorsese presents it. I don't know. They were engaged for
They
a
were.
while, weren't they?
They
Weren't
they
they?
were. Yeah, only were,
And
but they were both
um,
really independent. And sadly, Hughes was controlling. He basically wanted he wanted everyone to do what he
yeah,
wanted.
he
That
spied. He
was,
spied on the women in his lives. He bugged their
yeah,
phones and everything. He had
yeah,
security. Security follow them around at times. I think his wife his later Gene Peters. I think he followed had security following her around and
Yeah.
stuff like that. But let me ask you this, because I best I can make out the Aviator is pretty accurate historically, but it's a Hollywood film.
Hmm.
Uh, Spencer Tracy, Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn, I think, probably really loved each other, right? He
Yeah,
was
absolutely. Yeah.
married, having a relate. He was married and a Catholic, as I recall. And some photographer had a bunch of photographs of them together that he was going to make public. Did Howard Hughes did Howard
He
Hughes actually
prevented that. Yeah.
bribe that guy
Yeah.
to
He,
to
yeah, that
because
was one of the, yes.
he still loved
Yep.
Katharine Hepburn. He was trying to
Hmm.
protect her
Yeah.
from all this negative
And he did
publicity.
that often. He did these small things. A lot of the women, the reason the attraction was Hughes was not the macho type. Okay, he was certainly controlling, but he was soft spoken. The hearing impediment made him list, just not as active as the male, the macho males of the era, and he always had some kind of concern where after these relationships ended, he still took care of them. We kind of mentioned that with Frank Sinatra a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah,
But Hughes
right.
was more. He just had more resources and was able
Oh
to
yeah,
do that
yeah.
for
Let me bring up.
yeah,
We'll get to Ava Gardner and just
yeah,
discuss Sinatra. Ava Gardner's
a couple
a
of decades
major figure.
later.
Discuss
Yeah.
Howard
Hmm.
Hughes. Yeah, Ava Gardner's a major figure. But I want to discuss Gene Tierney for a minute here, who was
Hmm.
another major Hollywood. Oh God, Robert, I could look at
Yeah.
Gene Tierney all day.
Wow.
Yeah, what a pretty girl. Now she was a major star, 1940s and 50s. Laura, you ever
Yeah.
see the film Laura? I think that was one of
Hmm.
her most famous movies. He dated Gene Tierney for a while, although I don't think, according to her, their relation was never became romantic. But a couple of things about Gene Tierney. Was it her? Was one of his other girlfriends whose daughter was born, sickly or something? And Howard Hughes paid for all the medical
Yeah.
bills. And it was Gene Tierney, wasn't it? I think,
Momo,
and
it was Andy.
yeah,
It
yeah,
was
yeah. He paid for all
it was someone
the.
he did that for. I know that.
Yeah,
Whether it
yeah.
was her
I think it was
specifically,
Gene.
I'm
I
not.
think it was
No.
Gene Tierney.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Well, if not, it was one of his other, Hollywood starlet
Yeah.
girlfriends. But the child, the baby was born very sickly and was very expensive. And Howard Hughes paid for all the medical bills. And she said, she never forgot him for that. She always, was very enormously grateful for that. But
Hmm.
one thing that Gene Tierney, the reason I want to bring her up here, aside from the fact that
Yeah.
I could look at her this picture for hours. Um, but she had a great quote about Howard Hughes that I think we discussed some of the other women in his life, but the quote from Gene Tierney I think segues us perfectly into what Howard Hughes' career was fundamentally about. She said, "quote I don't think Howard could love anything that did not have a motor in it." Unquote. From Gene
Yes.
you know and I think that captures a big part of if we want to understand how it used, I think that captures a big part of him. He was in love with airplanes, he was in love with aviation, he was in love with designing, with aeronautical design. He was like, there we go, and he was a great test pilot. We have to discuss that.
Now let's just
But
move on now because it
yeah,
does segue. We're going from the 20s into the 30s,
yeah, and we could
1935
come back. We could come back to Ava Gardner later. But yeah,
to the
this
women.
does.
Yeah, because they
Yeah,
lasted for decades throughout his life. But
yeah, yeah. He remained
this was
friends.
his biggest
He was
passion.
able to remain friends with a number of the women that he'd had romantic relationships with,
Yeah.
which is that's not easy to do. A lot of times, romantic relationships when they end bitterly.
Hmm.
You know. So,
Hmm.
but anyhow,
So
yeah,
in the 30s, he sees that airplanes are his real passion. So he starts Hughes Aircraft, and he gets a job with American Airlines. First doing baggage claims, then as a co-pilot. Then they realize who he is, and they're like, "You can't work for us." It's kind of like Francisco in as a kid working. actually later in towards the end of Atlas, showing up as Frankie Adams. So that's what Howard Hughes was. He was learning the airline industry from American Airlines, and they let go of him, and then he starts doing these test pilot runs, and he wants to be the fastest, the fastest pilot in the world. 1935, he does that, 352 miles an hour. He does in California. They capture this in the film. When he breaks the record, loses control of the plane, lands in a beet field with beets, and he's not really injured poorly. Throughout the course of his life, he gets into 4 plane crashes, survives them all, which is amazing in itself. Then we go forward to the later on in the 30s, 1938. He does transcontinental Los Angeles to New York, breaks a record there. Then he wants to do around the world, and he does it in less than 4 days. The record was 8 days, I think, before then. So he cut it in half, and now he's just
Yeah,
he's at the Canyon of Heroes in New York.
Let me ask you a
Yeah,
stupid question. You're flying around the world. Did he have a co-pilot with him so he could take some
yeah,
naps, or was he had to
yeah.
fly the
He
whole
had a
thing by
stat.
himself?
Yeah, this wasn't Lindbergh, but solo.
Yeah,
He
okay, it
had
wasn't a solo. It wasn't a solo flight.
Yeah, and in
Okay,
fact, when they got to Paris, there was like 10-hour delay to do mechanical changes. I think they did Newfoundland, Ireland, Paris, and of course he stuck with the press. And being a shy person, he never wanted that complete adulation. Um, and when he arrives in New York, he sees, you're up in the air and you see the thousands and thousands of people waiting for you there, just cheering. And he wished he didn't have to do that, wished he didn't have to deal with the public in that sense. But he was a hero when he did ticker day parades in New York, in Houston. He went back to his homeland, 3 or 4 more cities in the Midwest, and then ended in California. So now he's known as a hero. And that was one of the things with his relationship with Katharine Hepburn, that she was used to being the star, and
right.
his star was shining brighter, and he had more, he had simply accomplished more. I mean, as he says in the movie, it's a bit, it's a bit sad, but it's accurate when he says you're an actress. In other words, you get
He
paid
said
to read
no
other people's minds.
in the Aviator. He says you're just a movie star, not even an actress. He goes, well, just a movie star.
Okay, you're right, a movie star. Yeah, yeah.
Hey,
Take
wait,
note,
let's
today's
say, yeah,
celebrities.
yeah.
Today,
Well,
we do not
in
care
fairness to
what you.
yeah, no, I understand. But in fairness to Katharine Hepburn, she was a great actress. Right? I think didn't she win
She
4
was a
Academy
great
Awards?
actress,
And yeah,
but
yeah. I mean, she wasn't just a movie
yeah,
star. She was a great actress. You know,
yeah,
but anyhow,
and
yeah. I mean, Howard
incredibly
Hughes was
independent in personal life too. Mhm.
yeah, yeah, she was.
But why don't you say,
Um,
Andy? Why don't you say one of your favorite lines in the movie when he meets her family, the snobbish New
oh
Englanders,
yeah,
for
yeah.
the
I don't.
first time?
Right, they're the Hepburn family in Connecticut, right? They're upscale, real leftists. They even say we're all a bunch of socialists. They even say, and then they have money, and they're I don't know if they're actual socialists. They may be, or maybe semi-socialists, but they're leftists, and they're denigrating money, and then they're putting it down. And Howard Hughes, says to them in the middle of the conversation, he says, you criticize money because you have it. You denigrate money because you have it, or something like that. He says, and they said, "What?" And he says it again. He says, "You denigrate money because you have it." Uh, now he came out of a
That's right.
wealthy family too, right? His father was, owned the tool company and everything,
Yes,
but
but
he was an
he
entrepreneur,
did.
was working hard to increase, to make a lot more money,
Here's
and
That's right. Here's the
yeah,
Francisco angle. Francisco
right,
d'Anconia, he inherits wealth, but what does he do? He magnifies it, exponentially. The amount that he's
yeah,
given, he
right.
doesn't just waste it. So that's what Howard
He's the
Hughes did. He
He's the
pours his own
climax of
money into
yeah,
everything.
he's the climax of the Hugheses, right? I mean,
Yeah.
he builds like the climax of the Deconians. He builds that fortune. But it's a very good point that people who are born with money, because what we could point out to these wealthy, these limousine leftist types is when they denigrate money, is and wealth, is there are people starving, literally starving all over the non-capitalist world and the non-industrialized world, who would want a lot
Mhm.
more of that mere material wealth, to feed their children, to make sure their children don't starve to death. And this is what
Yeah.
historically capitalism has achieved, raising living standards
Mhm.
so dramatically. But that's another story for another day. And in
But
real
it's a
life,
it's a good scene in the novel. It makes a good
it's a good
point
scene in the movie. Is it accurate?
in
Did
the
Howard
movie.
Hughes really? Did Howard Hughes actually
No, I don't
make
know
that
if he
comment to
did.
the
I mean,
Hepburn
he
family?
certainly did not get along with them. He certainly did not
Yeah,
get along with them, and there is that aspect. But he was pro money. I mean, he knew what it took, and we'll get to this shortly when we talk about in the 1940s. He starts accumulating shares of TWA with the intent to buy them, which he renames Trans World Airlines, and he wants to fly around the world. And another scene from the movie is the safety. People are not flying in planes because he got into 4 accidents himself, and they're scared. And he's like, "We need to fly above the weather, not 7,000 feet. We need to be
right,
20, thirty
right,
thousand feet." And that's
right.
where the safety factor comes in. And once we can do that, we'll be able to have these commercial airlines and become a success. And Trailblazers that wants to fly around the world. And we mentioned this, the competitor Pan Am has the monopoly on international flights. And so he fights their monopoly. And one of the dramatic scenes in the film, which is largely accurate, is simultaneously World War II breaks out, and he's helping, providing um, planes and designing planes to help America win the war. And there's a lot of German U-boats that are sinking, sending torpedoes that are destroying American vessels, and they want to have a plane that flies above,
Right,
above the water,
right.
and that's what he's designing there. And it never gets off the ground, during the war. So simultaneous, uh, within within him not succeeding in the war effort, he's accused of being a war profiteer with a senator from Maine, Brewster, who is in cahoots with the Pan Am CEO, Juan Tripp. And it's just one of the best scenes in the film
Yeah, yeah,
where,
really, yeah, yeah, it really is. And we're talking about the Scorsese film, The Aviator, and I think
yeah,
best I can make out, this is fairly accurate, right? The
completely accurate. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. That okay. Alec Baldwin, not one of my favorite people in the world, and is
no,
an innocent
he's
young
great
woman
at what
who's
he does,
dead.
though, in
Yes, yeah.
acting.
Is an innocent young woman who's dead because of his negligence, to put it
Yes.
mildly. Nevertheless, he's very good, in various roles, as an actor. He's excellent as Juan Tripp in The Aviator, and Alan Alda, excellent as this corrupt senator. He's having lunch with Howard Hughes, and he's telling him, if you sell TWA to Pan Am, these hearings, these investigation into war profiteering goes away. So he's going to he's going to make a deal. And Howard, DiCaprio, as Howard Hughes says something. You want to go to war with me? He
Yeah.
says, and Alan Alda, as a senator, says, "We're the United States government. We just defeated Nazi Germany and Imperial
Yeah.
Japan. Who the bleep are you?" It's a
Yeah.
great. He
Perfect.
finds out. Yeah, he finds out
Yeah.
who the bleep, Howard Hughes is. But at Senate hearings. But we should back up for just a minute, because tell me if
Sure.
this is correct, because before this happens, Howard Hughes, the mental illness, the combination of the
Yeah.
germ phobia and the painkillers. He's a drug addict now. He's painkillers from all of the injuries suffered in
Hmm.
various plane crashes and everything. The mental illness is at times is just overpowering. And in the Aviator, before the Senate hearings, he's holed up in his, in his studio watching, watching the reruns of
Movies.
The Outlaw. The film he made with Jane Russell. And the place is just a mess. I mean, it's just disgusting. And it's
Yeah.
in the film anyway. And tell me if this is accurate. Kate Beckinsale, who plays Ava Gardner, former, who was a big star in
Mhm.
Hollywood, very talented actress, beautiful woman, former lover of Howard Hughes, shows up, and he lets her in. And the first thing in the film, anyway, first thing he's just dressed in rags, and the place is a pit. And the first thing she says to him is, "I'm glad you dressed up for me." you know, and then she walks around the place, and it's just disgusting. And she says to him, "Love what you did with the place." It's very funny. And she cleans him up, cuts his hair and his beard, and
Yeah.
gets him dressed, and gives him the encouragement to go to the Senate hearings, and and face the
Mhm.
senator, and says to him, he thanks her profusely. She says to him, very touching, "You would do the same for me." And
Yeah.
there's
Which
the
is true.
benevolence here. Yeah. So is
Yeah.
is that is that actual is that real? Is it, did Ava Gardner
I think
did,
that's a compilation. Yeah, that's a
okay.
compilation of scenes. But the thing that is accurate is that he is at the Senate hearings and he says, he's accused of war profiteering. And what he does is he says all the other airlines who have built these planes, none of which took off during the war, way more money they got from the government than Hughes did. First of all, they didn't put any money in themselves, and they are not being investigated. And he says, I put my blood and my soul into this craft, and if it doesn't fly, I'm going to leave the country. And so what they do in the film is they simultaneously show, him in the Senate, and then they're trying to get this flying
Yeah,
boat,
well,
the
it's
Spruce Goose, they call it.
the spruce goose, right? But the injustice here, and Howard Hughes, DiCaprio was Howard Hughes in The Aviator, points this out. There's a lot of companies that took a lot of federal government money to design aircraft or various apparatus for the
Yeah.
U.S. military, and didn't deliver in time because the war ended before
Yeah.
these
Yeah.
innovations could be fully developed.
Hmm.
That doesn't mean the companies are crooks. It just means it takes time to develop new weapons, new products, new planes, new ships, new
Yes.
tanks, things
Very
like
good
that.
point.
And yeah, and thank God we won the war. The war ended. But
Hmm.
you're right. But the Spruce Goose, what was the real name for it? The Hercules? It was the
Yeah. The
Hercules, was
Hercules. Yeah.
it? I mean, it
Hmm.
was the most gigantic plane ever built at that time.
Ever built.
You know,
Yeah.
it was,
Yeah.
yeah,
And
and it
it's
was
still in a museum, I think. It's in a museum in Oregon right now, as kind of like a relic. But so he takes on the government, and as you said, yeah, the mental illness, it's starting to accumulate in his life. The germophobia, because he was the fourth plane crash, which is also in the movie where he landed in Beverly Hills. His heart shifted. There was so much
yes.
damage that his heart shifted from the left to his right side, all bandaged up.
That's
He's in the hospital bed. And here's a fun fact, you know how hospital beds tilt upwards? It was Hughes's idea that we should make a
is
contraption so that we're not just completely flat. And that was
is
one
that
of the
right?
things,
So
yeah,
that was one of his
another big
innovations.
achievement was, yeah, a Hughes Medical Institute, which came later on, right? Actually, right around that time, late 40s, early 50s, he came up with the idea for medical research, and had the doctor who had saved his life that um, after that plane crash. So, so yeah, his point here is that he's addicted to first morphine, and then they put him on codeine, which he was on for the rest of his life, and so the gradual mental degradation, the hearing problems, he's starting to become less effective, more remote, but still we're in the 40s and into the 50s. A couple of more things that he does. in the film industry. He buys RKO pictures, which they're going bankrupt, and he thinks, if I have my own, company, I can do more of what I want. But he was a bit of an absent owner, not that involved, except for the communist aspect. He was a staunch American, staunch capitalist, and knew that communism infiltrated. That we know the Red Decade, the
Mhm.
1930s communist propaganda, people who were in the Communist Party, and one of the writers, Jericho, was member of the American Communist Party, and Hughes wanted him out. He wouldn't hire anyone who he knew was a communist. And this is, of course, if you're a private business and you have the courage to do something like that, especially where they are so steeped in so many different levels in the government level. We've talked about this before, even in Roosevelt's administration, the number of communists. I mean, it's what free expression is one thing, but when the organization's direct goal is overthrowing the U.S. government,
Well, yeah.
you
I
need to
mean,
take what
if
actions
if
are
if
necessary.
I owned a Hollywood production company, I would make sure that I had no communists and no Nazis, on my
Hmm.
staff, especially not as writers spewing out communist or Nazi propaganda. It's a totalitarian manifestation. These guys want to destroy freedom. They want to
Yeah.
destroy individual rights. They're
Yep.
freaking monsters, both of them. And I would fire immediately anybody, or call into my office like Gail Wyman does with Tui in The Fountain. Remember, he said,
Yeah.
if I was back in my proletariat state in Hell's Kitchen, I'd begin this interview by saying, "Listen, louse, but since I'm an inhibited
But since I'm
capitalist,
respectable capitalist,
yeah, I mean,
right?
inhibited is the adjective he uses. I mean,
Yeah.
inhibited capitalist. Yeah. Well, if I owned a Hollywood production company like Howard Hughes at RKO, I would call these communist writers into my office and say, "Listen, louse, you want to work
Yeah.
here, you stop spewing the slightest degree of communist and Soviet propaganda, because it was strongly
Yeah.
suspected at the time and known with
Hmm.
complete certainty today that CPUSA took its orders from Moscow. It was a tool of Stalin's regime.
Hmm.
Bloodiest totalitarian state in history is certainly one of them. I said, listen, Laos,
Hmm.
I want to say, not a speck of communist propaganda out of you. If you're a talented writer, you write, but not an iota of communist propaganda. You're out on the street. I'm firing you in a heartbeat. I'd make that very clear. I don't want any Soviet
Yeah.
propaganda or Nazi propaganda if the Nazis were still around. In any movie that comes out of my studio.
And that's a good point, because you're blending the two types of totalitarians. And there was one movie called The Whip Hand, which I haven't seen, but I read about. It was originally against the Nazis; they were the villains in it. But it came out in the late '40s, and the Nazis were done. And Howard Hughes said, "No, change it. Make the communists the
Yeah,
the
the
villains in
Soviets, right?
this."
The Soviets.
And
Yeah.
so, yeah, exactly. Make the Soviets the villains, while the American intellectuals are sucking up to them. American politicians are sucking up to them. Howard Hughes did not. So, and he's facing censors in. We didn't talk about Jane Russell and The Outlaw, which was so he faced the censors against the mob
Right, right,
with Scarface pushing
right.
the envelope there. Then 1942, he makes The Outlaw, and Jane Russell, the movie is about her assets, basically, with a little plot. Billy the Kid
Yeah,
and Doc
yeah.
Holliday as two
The out,
characters.
the Outlaw has very minimal plot. Well, again, it's how you special effects. If it's spectacular aerial stunts or
Yeah.
Jane Russell's breasts, showing a
Mhm.
lot of cleavage to it. That's really the who's in the Outlaws. Not even Jane Russell really so much. Jane Russell's breasts are the star, of the Outlaws. Constant cleavage, and in the Aviator, clean up the language. He does use the word breasts. He says, but in the Aviator, DiCaprio says about this, who doesn't like breasts? He doesn't use that. He uses a more slangy term, but you get the idea. Yeah, that's. I
But
mean,
he's for the censor. He's right in front of the
yeah,
censor
right, right.
board in the Aviator, and he's got the caliper measuring. He's got his engineer measuring.
Right, he's
All
showing
these
us
other
right. Yeah,
fans.
yeah, I don't know if that happened in real life, everybody, I'm not sure, but in the film The
Me neither.
Aviator, he's got he's got a whole bunch of picture photographs of Hollywood starlets, and they
Yeah,
not even on their face, but of their cleavage. They're showing a certain amount of breast, and he has his. You're right, Robert. In the movie, he has his scientist buddy with the caliber showing how much cleavage. Here's Yvonne DiCarlo, and he is Ava Gardner, and he is Rita Hayworth, and he is Jane Russell, and how much cleavage. It's really the scene's
yeah.
hilarious.
It is, but
But
he
yeah,
catches them in their
he stands
hypocrisy,
up.
just
He
as he
stands up
does
to yeah. He
in
stands
the
up to the
hearing.
censors. He stands up to the
Yeah,
censors.
and he
Yeah,
catches them in their hypocrisy, similar to in the Senate hearings. That, wait a minute, why are you singling me out? Is it because I'm, I think of Ayn Rand with a money making personality and this kind of hatred and envy of wealthy people that that I'm sure he faced his whole life because he had money, made money, from effort, certainly from his honest effort, and whatever he touched expanded. And so with um, with that comes a lot of envy, and people with political power and journalists who don't make a lot of money. There are muckrack, rakers out there who want to tear you down. And so RKO basically goes, they go under his phobias and paranoia start to escalate if we move on to the latter part of his life. Um,
well, wait a minute, wait a
and
minute. But wait, first thing,
yeah,
let's backtrack just a second because
sure.
he actually does fly the Spruce Goose, right? The Hercules actually does
Yeah,
actually does,
gets it up.
does fly, right? And he showed because
Yes.
you're right. He had vowed to leave the country, and not return if he failed in this. And it's a
Hmm.
seaplane, right? It's gigantic. Showed in the Aviator, and I think this is accurate in real life, right? Late
Yeah, it is.
1940s, late 1940s, he gets this enormous transport plane to
Hmm.
fly. Now,
Hmm.
I don't know. I don't think it was ever actually used.
No,
I think,
no, he
but
just proved that it could
he
fly,
showed
and
it was feasible. He showed it was
yeah,
feasible that it could be done.
that's right.
Yeah,
That's right. And
right,
there was no other. There was no. Its purpose was basically to save either coast of America, from foreign torpedoes. And after World War II, that never happened again.
right.
Korean War was at the other side of the world. There was no activity near America's waters,
So,
which is
so
what that ship
wait a
was.
minute. So the Spruce Goose, the Hercules, was it? It wasn't designed as a transport to transport large amounts of troops or weapons to from
No, it was
home
for
to the battlefield.
torpedoes.
It
There were
was anti
torpedo
it was
attacks.
anti submarine warfare. Is that what
Yeah, yeah,
the was?
that's right.
Okay, all right, okay,
Yeah.
all right,
Hmm.
interesting. Yeah,
Hmm.
well, that was a big issue in World War II for sure. You're dealing with, to some extent with
That's right.
Japanese submarines in the Pacific, but overwhelmingly with the German submarines, U-boat
The German
warfare
U-boats. Yeah, it
in
was
the
an
Atlantic.
antidote to
Yeah.
that. Hmm.
Okay. I didn't realize.
Hmm.
All right. All right. It's too bad. Too bad. Couldn't get it done, in time. But that happened a lot during World War II. These innovations take time,
Exactly.
like
Yeah. I
as we
mean,
already said.
we mentioned in the Midway episode how unready the American
Oh yeah.
naval forces were. So it's like you can't do everything in 3 years and have everything working
Right.
that
Yeah, and
fast. It was amazing what they.
the naval aircraft, the Japanese Zeros, all the pilots said were much better planes than the Americans had prepared,
Yeah,
at least early in the war. Maybe by the end of the war, the American planes presumably were better, but maybe better than the Japanese Zeros. I don't know. But yeah, at the start of the
yeah.
war, woefully unprepared. Uh, but anyhow, so yeah, can we get into
So
the
the later part of
yeah?
his life, he discovers Las Vegas. He had done some flying there. He would send Ava Gardner. He'd bring her to Vegas. He'd have one actress for dinner, and then he'd take Ava Gardner to Vegas for a night in the town, then bring her back home. That was like one of his things. But he finds himself
By
in
the
one of the.
way, Robert,
Yeah,
speaking of Ava Gardner, in the Aviator, he's given her this beautiful necklace or something. and she refuses it. She said, "I'm not for sale." Now he's like, "I
Yes.
just want to give you this gift." She said, "I'm not for sale." She said, I want to buy this for you." And she says to him, "Buy me dinner," she says to him. And then,
True.
yeah, at the end, after the Spruce Goose, I think I'm trying to remember. He wants to take her to Paris. Or something. He wants
He
to take Ava
offered that.
Gardner to Paris.
Once
Yeah,
he
he offered.
once TWA was able to go international, that was what he said. Yeah, I would like to go to Paris, and she's like, for dinner, right?
Yeah, yeah, exactly, exactly. She says yes. She said, take me to dinner." So, but anyway, I just
Hmm.
wanted to come back to that. That definitely in real life, and it's touching because, like I said, a lot of times when romantic relationships break up, they're bitter. And Howard Hughes
Yeah.
was able to remain on good terms with a number of his former lovers, Ava Gardner, I think Katharine Hepburn, I think a
Yes.
number of them, they were
Yeah.
on good terms. It shows a lot of goodwill on both parts, a lot of good heartedness, a lot of benevolence, to use Ayn Rand's favorite term here. And see,
That's right.
it's touching. And I think it was Ava Gardner. Again, there was so many girlfriends. I mean, and lovers. I can't even keep track of them all. But I think it was Ava Gardner who said about, affectionately, about Howard Hughes, that he was the most eccentric person. He was soft spoken, he was gentle, he was shy,
Yes.
and that he was very
Most of them
shy,
said
and
that. Yeah.
yeah, he was very painfully shy, very eccentric, but a good hearted person, something like that.
Hmm.
She said about
Yeah.
about him.
Yeah.
So
One time he had Olivia de Havilland, who is from Gone with the Wind, and her sister, Joan Fontaine, until the two sisters found out, and then they both
he
like dumped
he
him.
was he had a relation with both of them at the same time. Oh my god.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right,
So
that's
it's yeah, there's a lot there. And
yeah.
what I'm trying to grapple with is this whole germaphobe aspect, which they kind of cover in the movie. The first time he drinks milk that Katharine Hepburn drank, it's like he struggles before from the drinking from the same bottle, and he realizes, I got to get over. I'm spinning in circles here, and I'm gonna have to deal with this issue. But gradually, he becomes more and more of a recluse. So he's in Las Vegas, top floor of a hotel. I can't remember the name of it, but he overstays his welcome, and they're the curtains haven't been touched in a year, and they're all decrepit. And he's like, "I'll buy the hotel," and he just buys the hotel, and then realizes the value in Vegas of
They're
property.
gonna kick me out.
And
They're gonna kick me out, right? They're gonna kick me out. So I'll just buy the joint. That's
that's
nice to
what
be
he
a billionaire.
does.
I know, I know.
And there's another hotel, the silver, it's got like a silver spike, I think, and it was a woman's shoe that it bothered him looking at the shoe outside of his window, so he buys that hotel. And then he realizes, he's told that no, that's a big draw. He wants them to get rid of the shoe because it blurs his vision. And once they tell him, no, that's a big draw, he realizes that money can be made. And he's like, all right, leave the shoe. It stays. So those kind of things, he's always finding ways to make money,
And
but he
Vegas was
wants to
founded by
legitimize it.
gangster. Vegas was founded by gangsters, right? Was Bugsy Siegel was
And
one of the
and
founders,
the and the
of
point
Vegas?
here, Andy, once again, he wants to legitimize it. He
Right,
says this
right.
should be a town where well-dressed men and glamorous women go out to enjoy themselves, and gradually that's what happened. So we talk about all the different industries that he radically changed, and Vegas was the last one of the lot that he did that for. And what we know of Vegas today, it's largely because he was a pivotal change in the whole mood of that town. And sadly, now he's becoming more and more of a recluse, a germaphobe. Some of my research reasons why he would be naked all day long, and his hair and nails would grow, is his skin was really sensitive to touch. So even wearing clothes would would be incredibly painful, and cutting hair and cutting nails, like these were all excruciatingly painful activities for him. So we just let them go. And so you talk about your childhood, Andy, and that's all you heard about the Howard
Right.
Hughes
Exactly. That's all I knew
version.
about Howard
Similar
Hughes.
to me, but because my family was more of they were more film buffs, I had known that side about him to some extent. But I'll never forget one day, I remember my mother saying Howard Hughes is the richest man in the world, and nobody knows where he is. And I get on a train from the Bronx and I go to Manhattan and I go walking around looking for Howard Hughes. I'm like 10 years old and I'm like, I want to meet the richest man in the world. Spoiler alert,
Funny.
I didn't find him.
Yeah, right. You weren't as successful as Dominique Franken walking the streets of New York looking for another Howard.
That's right.
Howard Rook. Although she didn't find him on the street, she found him at Kiki Holcomb's salon.
That's true. Actually,
She
staying
did,
in the
but you find him.
Fountainhead, Andy, staying in the fountain, this picture we have, this is like it's Gail Wyman when
Yeah,
he
that's right.
goes and drops food and Bibles on top of a South American country. Like
Right,
the way he
right. He was
generates news, he's part of the news, and
he-
I
right.
can equate to some extent. I can equate Howard Hughes as far as the creativity with a Walt Disney or a Steve Jobs later on in life, where there was some eccentricities, but the incredible creativity. But those guys didn't put their lives on the line as test
Right,
pilots, breaking the
right.
world, and that's where Disney is. Like he's on. I'm sorry, that's where Howard Hughes is on a different level. And one of the planes he flew, by the way, was Jackie Cochran's, who we covered in a prior
Oh, is that right?
the Aviatrix. And
Right.
so sadly in Vegas, his health is declining. He's becoming more of a recluse. And basically the last 25 years of his life, hardly anyone saw him. He didn't, he became, this myth. And here's where, Andy, we've talked about this in the past. It's sad because this is where I think friendship comes into mind. Where if you're only surrounded by aides who you're paying to give you the drugs, to give you codeine, to give you hypodermic needles, of which they found 5 in his arm
Mm.
when he passed away, 5 broken. Yeah, it's gross,
Uh,
amazing. This man who spent so much money on a medical institute and who created so many, so much value in so many different fields, he's withering away. He's under 90 pounds by the time he dies. He's holed up in Acapulco towards the end of his life. And if he had friends that he could confide in, and instead of just aides who he just, yelled orders to, then things could have been different. Things definitely could have
sure,
been different in his
sure.
life. But
Well, if you that, but if
sadly,
you, yeah,
he's
yeah.
remembered.
I know that's how I knew him. That as this very eccentric, germophobic recluse holed up in
Yeah,
his Vegas hotel. That's all I heard about Howard Hughes as a kid in the 1960s. It was only decades later,
yeah,
like I said, that I found
yep.
out what an extraordinary achiever he was, and on such a broad base. He is in so many different fields. But when you're that reclusive and that eccentric, it's hard to stay in close have close friendships. I mean, he was married. There's just two last points I'd want to make. I know he was married for about 14 years to Gene Peters, who was also a very
The end of his life.
successful,
Yeah.
yeah, 1957 to 1971, I think. Uh,
Hmm.
who was also very successful Hollywood actress. Well, she was a very attractive woman. She resisted all those sex siren roles. She wanted to play, she didn't want to play those glamour girls, the la femme fatale
Right.
kind of roles. But they were married for like 14 years. But he was and according to Jack Anderson, the columnist, who I think was, who knew he and Howard Hughes knew each other well. Maybe they were buddies, maybe they weren't, but I think they knew
Hmm.
each other well. Gene Peters was the love of Howard Hughes' life, at least according to him.
Hmm.
Uh, uh,
Hmm.
but it's hard to maintain a relationship with somebody who's that germophobic or that reclusive. It'd be hard.
Yeah.
So to be close friends would be very difficult. So your point's well taken, but the very mental illness makes is what makes that so difficult. You know,
Yeah.
so that's
And
one.
and
Yeah, go ahead.
and where you and I accept free will as a given, but you wonder, where does free will become? Where do you reach a point where you're so addicted that you give up free will, that which is the greatest tragedy in anybody's life, where you lose control, where you're unable to make rational decisions. That's something that kind of perplexes me about people like Howard Hughes, where I'm sure there were choices, there were chances in his life where he could have said no and just didn't, and
Yeah, with his
slid
money, Robert.
descended.
Let me ask you this. And you may know the answer to this. With all his money, he could have afforded the finest psychotherapist in the world. Did he ever go into
Yeah,
psychotherapy? Did he ever like?
no,
Did he?
not to
See that?
my knowledge. It's
That's
funny. I found a YouTube video of a guy, a psychotherapist, who actually analyzes his conditions and you know thinks he could have helped. Certainly could have helped him, but no, I don't think. I don't think that was a legitimate field in Hughes's mind that
Yeah,
he
1940s,
could have
1950s
gone
is still disdain or shrinks. We don't we only
exactly.
we don't go
Yeah,
see a shrink and everything.
that's
it's only more recently that it's become more acceptable to
yeah.
to go into
But
psychotherapy now.
first billionaire, I mean, the other thing is the word billion. If you type in Google first billionaire, it comes up Rockefeller. But Rockefeller was not a billionaire during his lifetime. It's like extrapolated to today's
Yeah, he had the
numbers.
purchasing power in today's
Right.
money of a
Hughes
billion.
was a billionaire in real
Right,
time. He was the
right,
first
right, right,
billionaire. I mean, that's
right.
an achievement, in itself as well. And so, um, but yeah, sadly, the end of his life, he's going to different places to get more codeine. The Bahamas first, and then Mexico, and then a flight on the way from Mexico to Houston. He dies en route. And the other tragedy in his life, and this affected Ayn Rand. I've heard Leonard Peikoff mention this, that his estate, he didn't have like a definitive will. This is what I want to happen with this. This money goes to this person. So everyone came out of the woodwork for his money. Relatives who never heard
Sure,
of. There was
sure.
there was a biography written of him, unauthorized, biography that was like a scam. And so now everyone's on the Hughes gravy train. And I remember Leonard Peikoff saying Ayn Rand witnessed that. And she said she's making a will. She's going to make it very clear what's going to happen with her estate after she's gone, because Hughes did it all wrong. And this is for listeners out there. You should have a will or a trust or something where you definitively know what you want to happen
Yeah,
with your
and
legacy.
the
And,
more assets you have, the more important that
yes,
becomes.
absolutely, absolutely, and so that was another failure on this part. I mean, he certainly
Right.
has. We never neglect to mention flaws in the heroes that we talk about. We might not cover all of them, but that was a major one. So I think the friendship and the not legacy, not a crystal clear legacy of what to do with with his wealth, with such an enormous amount of wealth. But much of it did go to the Hughes Medical Institute, and so we certainly give him credit for that. So if we think, Andy, innovative movie maker, airline, record breaker airline pilot, and then manufacturer of planes, industrialist with the Hughes Tool Company, medical, changes Las Vegas, all these different, completely different fields,
Right.
the variety, and like Midas, whatever he touches, eventually turns into gold.
Yeah,
And these are
the
the
thing that
things. The reason we like Aviator is that's the essence of Howard Hughes and not the other part. But go
right.
ahead. I'm sorry.
Right. Yeah, the thing that impresses me most about Howard Hughes is that outstanding filmmaker, outstanding aviation engineer or designer, aeronautical designer, uh, and
Hmm.
outstanding test pilot, and yet
Yeah.
he still, as an entrepreneur, post World War II, challenges Pan Am's monopoly status for round the
Yeah.
world flights, and he brings TWA builds TWA, renames it. What was it? What was it? Texas West. I forget its original name,
Right. It
but
had the TWA, but it
this
was a
yeah,
different name.
yeah,
He
it was
kept the
Texas
initials.
Western, something like that. I don't
Yeah.
remember the exact, but it was the initials what TWA, but he changed that to Trans World Airlines and
Yeah.
becomes an international airline challenging Pan Am's monopoly. So he was we commended Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore, as an anti-monopolist entrepreneur, which he
That's right.
certainly was. Well, same for Howard
Yep.
Hughes, and so and this was after he'd already accomplished so much in 3 or 4 different other fields. So
Yeah.
I think we could salute the Aviator. A man who, as
Yes, we
Gene
can.
Tierney said, didn't love anything that didn't have a motor in it. And he was a great aviation engineer and a great entrepreneur and a
Yeah.
great Hollywood filmmaker and a great test pilot. And Scorsese's film, The Aviator, is very good. Shows the mental
Highly
illness that
recommend it.
eventually kills
Hmm.
him, as it must, but focuses on the great man's achievements. And so I think we
Yeah.
could say, Robert, Howard Hughes showed us how you could be a hero in multiple fields. And I think we
What's
could take
possible.
inspiration from that.
Hmm.
Yeah, take inspiration from that. So I want to wish you and everybody out there in Hero Land, hope you guys have a heroic day. And let's all strive to lead more
Thank you. You
heroic
too.
lives. And we'll be
Yes.
back next week, everybody. I'll see you again on The Hero Show.